Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our video on intergovernmental fiscal relations. Up to this point in time in this class, we've talked primarily about own source revenue. So we've talked primarily about revenue that is generated from things like the property tax, the sales tax, fines and forfeitures, user charges and user fees, transient occupancy taxes, otherwise known as hotel taxes. But primarily what we have discussed is revenue that comes from a city or local government's own source revenue. What I'd like to talk about in this video is the presence of intergovernmental fiscal transfers as a source of revenue for a lot of local governments. As we know, some local governments have become relatively reliant upon intergovernmental grants and aid. So it's important for us to talk about what those grants and aid look like, where they came from, some of their advantages as well as some of their disadvantages. But before we get into a specific discussion of the different types of grants that are available to local governments to access for revenue, I think it's important that we talk about some of the basic principles of intergovernmental fiscal relations. And we'll start off with three main principles. The first principle is what we call the fiscal correspondence principle. Fiscal correspondence tells us that if a government is being influenced by a decision, that government should be involved in the decision-making process. So if a government is going to be fiscally impacted by some decision that is being made, that government should be involved in making decisions about how to pay for that policy or that program. So basically, the decision-making for a policy or program should correspond with the governments who are being impacted by that policy or that program. So whenever we have the national government institute a national mandate and apply it to a state or a local government, fiscal correspondence would tell us that mandate will impose some fiscal impacts upon those state and local governments. So therefore, those state and local governments should be involved in the decision-making process. So the decision-making and those involved in decision-making should correspond well with the impacts, especially the fiscal impacts, of that policy or that program. So the fiscal correspondence principle will argue for more of a decentralization of decision-making, allowing state and local governments to be involved in making decisions about things that will have a fiscal impact upon them. Then your second principle there is what's called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity means that if the national government issues a mandate for state and local governments, basically tells state and local governments they must take a certain type of action, that it then is incumbent upon that national government to provide the resources for the state or local government to carry out that action. So subsidiarity says if you're going to tell some government to do something, you better give them the resources to do it. So again, subsidiarity, like fiscal correspondence, argues for a decentralization of resources. An unfunded or a partially funded mandate is a good example of a violation of the subsidiarity principle. The American system of federalism historically does not do a very good job maintaining subsidiarity. Some other federalism systems across the world, such as Australia, they tend to do a much better job with subsidiarity. So fiscal correspondence and subsidiarity are going to argue for more of a decentralization and devolution of decision-making within the intergovernmental system. Then your third principle on the screen there is the economic principle of economies of scale. We're all familiar with economies of scale. If you buy things in volume, you buy things in bulk, you hopefully will be more cost efficient. And so economies of scale would argue for action being done at the largest level of government, that being the national level of government. So economies of scale, unlike correspondence and subsidiarity, economies of scale will argue for more of a centralization of functions and centralization of decision making. Well, so what? Why is this important? This is important because these three principles do not necessarily work in the same direction. Fiscal correspondence and subsidiarity pull us toward decentralization and more power and more of a role for state and local governments, whereas economies of scale will argue for more centralization and more unilateral action by the national government. Well, how do these principles then get embodied within the Constitution? Because we have to go back to the Constitution if we truly want to understand intergovernmental relations and intergovernmental fiscal relations. Because as we know, and you know from your undergraduate American government and civics courses, the Constitution provides for us a two-way separation of powers. Provides for us horizontal separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, but that also provides for us a vertical separation of powers between national and state governments. And today, as the intergovernmental relations system has grown, we now include local governments in that equation as well. But it's a vertical separation of powers called federalism. So how does federalism play out in the Constitution? Well, as you know, the Constitution is a series of compromises. It had to be a series of compromises in order to be ratified. So we had a lot of differences at the Constitutional Convention. We had differences between large states and small states, and that those differences were taken care of or mitigated through the Connecticut Compromise, through the idea of having a bicameral legislature, proportional representation in the House of Representatives, equal representation in the Senate. Our second major conflict that we had was the conflict between slave states and non-slave states. And again, that was addressed very poorly, but it was addressed by the framers with the 3/5 compromise and the rules against banning the slave trade until at least 1808. Then the third conflict we had was between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists like Madison wanted to see a stronger national government in the new Constitution. Anti-Federalists like Sherman wanted to see states retain their sovereignty and believed that state governments were the correct repository of power. They were the correct type of government that should be exercising most of the power in our social contract. So what the framers had to do is they had to balance the wants, needs, and desires of the Federalists against those of the Anti-Federalists. So we end up with this series of compromises, and the compromises can actually end up being very much conflictual in nature, in that some of the compromises will pull us more toward a stronger national government, while other compromises pull us more toward state sovereignty and states' rights. You all know that we have a supremacy clause in the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution says that the Constitution, treaties, and laws of the United States shall be the supreme laws of the land, meaning that when national constitution and national laws come into conflict with state constitutions and state laws, the national constitution and the national laws win. That supremacy clause obviously argues for a centralization of power within the national government. But then in order to get this Constitution ratified and to appeal to the citizens of New York for ratification, we had to then add on a Bill of Rights. James Madison wrote this Bill of Rights, these 10 amendments to the Constitution, amended the Constitution immediately upon writing it, almost immediately. And the 10th Amendment to the Constitution became known as the Reserved Powers Amendment. The rights that are not granted to Congress and that are not expressly prohibited from the states are reserved to the states and or the people. So on one end, in the Article 6, you have this supremacy clause, national government is supreme. Then in the 10th Amendment, the Reserved Powers Amendment, you have this enunciation of the power of state governments, that if there are powers that are not given to the national government, then according to the 10th Amendment, those powers then get reserved for the states and or the people. So again, you can see the conflict between national versus state power. Another conflict you can see between national and state power comes in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lays out the powers of Congress, and it will enumerate the powers of Congress. Whenever you enumerate anything, you are listing it. So it lists the specific powers of Congress. Congress may levy and collect taxation. Congress may raise armies and navies. Congress may establish post offices. Congress may coin money. Congress may regulate commerce between the states. All those are listed enumerated powers. Whenever you list specific powers, by definition, what you are doing is you are limiting the power of that branch of government. So you're limiting Congress's powers by listing them. Because the assumption is anything that is not enumerated, anything that is not listed, is not a power of Congress. So by enumerating powers, you are essentially arguing for limited power for the national legislature, and then the void of all the rest of the power for all those powers that are not being listed, that void is then filled by state legislatures. However, as you also probably know, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, you have this elastic clause, this necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the national government. So basically, what we're saying is Congress can do anything that it needs to do in order to carry into execution, to actually do these enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. That's a very broad grant of power. And so that is very much a centralizing type of force in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So we certainly have this conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, between a strong national government and retaining state sovereignty and states' rights. And that conflict, that uneasy balance between national and state power has really been what has characterized federalism over the past 200 plus years. So because of that, because of some of these enunciations of state power with the 10th Amendment and with the enumeration of powers of Congress, what we ended up seeing is we ended up seeing a duality in federalism after the ratification of the Constitution. And throughout the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, we characterize our system of balance of powers between different levels of government as being dual federalism, in that the federal government had its sphere of influence and state governments had their sphere of influence. And there is a line of demarcation in terms of power between the two levels of government. For our purposes in a budgeting course, that line of demarcation was drawn by the Supreme Court in the very famous Supreme Court case back in 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland. And the court in McCulloch versus Maryland established a federalism principle known as reciprocal tax immunity. The court in McCulloch versus Maryland had to deal with a situation where Congress had created a national bank called the Second Bank of the United States. That national bank had essentially branch offices in the states, what we call a branch office today. It had one of these quote-unquote branch offices in Baltimore, Maryland. The problem was the state of Maryland had a law that allowed the state to tax the fiscal notes that were issued by any bank within that state. Second Bank of the United States was located in Maryland, so Maryland applied its tax to all the notes that were issued by this national bank in Baltimore. Problem with that is that the national bank is national and Maryland is a state. So you had a state government taxing the national government. The court in McCulloch versus Maryland said that that is not constitutional. And John Marshall, in writing the decision, said the power to tax is equivalent to the power to destroy. That we allow the state to tax the national government, that's equivalent to allowing the state to destroy the national government and vice versa. So it establishes this reciprocal tax immunity. One level of government may not tax another level of government. So we have this duality, this separation fiscally between national and state governments. But as you also know, as you move into the 1900s, you have the stock market crash, you have the Great Depression, and you have the FDR administration beginning all these programs and creating all these alphabet agencies in order to try and funnel grant money from the national government to the states to help states address the problems of the Great Depression. So you start to see this real commingling of the functions between national and state governments. And so a lot of federalism scholars will argue that once that happened in the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s, you no longer had this duality. You didn't have dual federalism, but you had a different era of federalism known as cooperative federalism, where the national and state governments were sharing a lot of their functions. If you look at it in terms of a theoretical model, cooperative federalism, that era, is really marked by the model known as overlapping authority. So the authority of the federal government starts to overlap with the authority of state governments. That is a constitutional principle, really starts to erode this idea of reciprocal tax immunity. And over the ensuing years, Congress continues to chip away at reciprocal tax immunity. Till we get to 1986 in the Tax Reform Act, which we've mentioned earlier in this class. In the Tax Reform Act, whenever Congress said that municipal debt is not necessarily exempt from federal income taxation, that was them really dealing a major blow to this idea of reciprocal tax immunity. As we had also mentioned earlier in the class, 2 years later, that Tax Reform Act, that provision was then challenged in the Supreme Court in South Carolina versus Baker. And that is where the Supreme Court basically drove a stake through the heart of reciprocal tax immunity and essentially said there really isn't reciprocal tax immunity anymore unless Congress wants it to be there. If Congress decides not to have reciprocal tax immunity, if Congress decides that it wants and needs to start taxing state and local governments, it has the ability to decide to do so. So whenever you see reciprocal tax immunity as a constitutional principle go away, you really do start to see even more of an intermingling of functions and authority between national and state governments. So that duality of dual federalism is long gone. So when you've got that type of intermingling of functions, you would anticipate that the federal government would develop a set of tools that it could use to get state and local government cooperation to achieve national objectives. And the two main tools that the national government uses to get state and local governments to do its bidding are grants and aid and mandates. Grants and aid are the carrot approach, mandates are the stick approach. Typically, the national government will try a grant program to induce compliance on the part of state and local governments. If it works, great, they've got their compliance. If state and local governments push back and they refuse to meet those national objectives with a grant, then the national government, if it can, will then move into the stick approach and start using mandates. So let's take a look at different types of grants and different types of mandates, what they are, how they work, and some of their impacts that they have on local government finance. So in terms of grants and aid, there are several different categories, no pun intended, of grants and aid. The first category is what's called a categorical grant. And many of you may work with categorical grants on a daily basis, so you're familiar with them. Categorical grant is a very specific grant of money for a very specific purpose. So here is money that must be used on this specific purpose, for this specific type of expenditure, for this specific type of program. There are usually very frequent and very strict reporting requirements for those categorical grants. The recipient, the state or local government, does not have much flexibility at all in terms of how they spend that categorical grant money. Then at the opposite end, we'll skip block grants for a second. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have what was called general revenue sharing, another type of grant. General revenue sharing was when the federal government literally turned over a percentage of federal income tax revenue to state and local governments, or usually state governments, with very few, if any, strings attached. So they would literally turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue to state governments and tell state governments, spend it as you see fit. Spend it however you think will benefit your citizens. So obviously, you've got a lot more flexibility for state governments with revenue sharing and very little flexibility with categorical grants. So if you look at these on a spectrum, on the far end of the spectrum, you have categorical grants with very little flexibility for state and local governments. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have general revenue sharing, affords a great deal of flexibility. Problem with general revenue sharing is that there is no revenue to share. As you go through the 1980s, the deficit continues every year to get bigger and bigger and bigger, so much so that in 1986, President Reagan actually abolished general revenue sharing. General revenue sharing was first an idea of the Nixon administration and his really tendency to want to try and decentralize and devolve decision-making outside of Washington, D.C. Reagan agreed with that. He agreed with decentralization, devolution, but his problem was there was no revenue to share. If there's no revenue to share, why do you continue with the program? So in 1986, general revenue sharing was abolished at the federal level. So we just kind of include it here as a teaching tool to show the major difference between categorical grants on the one end of the spectrum and revenue sharing on the other end. So obviously there must be something in the middle ground. And what's in the middle ground are these block grants. And again, some of you have probably dealt with block grants before. Block grants afford more flexibility than a categorical grant, but not as much flexibility as general revenue sharing. Block grants, those proceeds are meant to be spent in general programmatic areas. So a general programmatic area could be educating at-risk youth. As long as the recipient, the government that's receiving the funds, is spending that money to educate at-risk youth, specifically how they spend the money will be left up to them. So if you want to spend the money on after-school tutoring programs, you can do that if it furthers the goal of educating at-risk youth. If you want to spend it on computer literacy programs, you can do that. If you want to spend it on job training programs, you can do that as well. If you want to spend it on midnight basketball programs, you can do that. So it affords you the flexibility to spend the money specifically how you want, as long as how you're spending it, those activities, further the goals of the major program, which is educating at-risk youth. Now, what we saw Reagan do in his administration is not only get rid of general revenue sharing, but he also took 187 categorical grant programs, a lot of them created in the Johnson administration, and consolidated those 187 categorical grants into about 12 block grants to give more discretion and flexibility to state and local governments in how they spend the money. Well, that's great for state and local governments to get more flexibility and autonomy. The problem was there's a trade-off. That as they gave that additional flexibility to state and local governments, the Reagan administration also then had draconian cuts to the amount of spending. So you got a lot less money, but you got more flexibility. So it's kind of very much a bittersweet pill for state and local governments to swallow. But then you still see a lot of categorical grants programs used. You also see a lot of block grant programs used as well. How these grants are given out differs, again, depending upon how they are designed. Some of these programs, the grant programs, are given out on what's called a project basis. A project-oriented grant means that the potential recipients will compete for that grant money. So they will literally put together grant proposals, submit those grant proposals to the national government, and the national government will then select the proposals they think are most, that merit funding the most, and they think are most credible. With a project type of grant, you end up having a whole lot of grantsmanship that goes on at the local level. So you'll see local governments chasing these grants, and they'll hire grant writers in order to try and chase these grants and chase that free, quote unquote, free federal money. And we'll actually put a lot of resources into chasing federal grants when those resources could have been spent on other local priorities. But that's a project-oriented type of approach. Then you can also have what we call a formulaic grant, a formula-based approach. With a formulaic grant, we will have literally a formula. And we'll take the characteristics of that government, we'll plug them into the formula, and then the result will tell us what governments get the money and how much money those governments get. Classic example of formulaic grant money funding is in terms of education funding. So most states have what they call foundation education programs, which means that they create a equation, they create a formula, then they'll take the characteristics of that school district, plug them into the formula, and that will then tell you how much that school district gets. California uses that, and so what California will do is they'll take characteristics of a school district, such as what they call their unduplicated pupil percentage, the UPP. And the unduplicated pupil percentage will be the percentage of students who are English learners, or who are in special education programs, or who are in free and reduced lunch programs, or who are foster youth. And you will put that percentage into the formula, and then if you have a higher percentage of your students who fall into those categories, you will then get a higher base grant than a district that has a lower percentage. So if 90% of your students fall into that unduplicated pupil percentage category, you're going to get a much bigger base grant from the state than if only 20% of your students fall into those categories. So formulaic funding is something that's very commonly used in education funding to determine how much state base grant each local school district can get. So we also have to consider whether the grant is a project-based grant or a formulaic grant. We also then have to consider whether or not that grant has matching components. The federal government, if the federal government is very interested in achieving this national objective, they want to truly incentivize state and local governments to put money toward achieving this objective, the federal government will offer matching grants. They'll say, we will match dollar for dollar. Every dollar that the state or local government raises for this project up to a certain amount. So up to $5 million, we will match dollar for dollar with federal money. Well, that's great in terms of being quote unquote free money for state and local governments. It's not own source revenue, it's not tax revenue. But the problem with that obviously is the distortion of local preferences. That you may have these two projects that are very close to each other in terms of how much you want to fund them. Their benefit cost ratios are very similar to each other, Project A and Project B. National government comes along and says, well, we will match every dollar you spend on Project B up to $10 million. But now suddenly the cost of Project B has now plummeted, which makes the benefit cost ratio look a heck of a lot better than for Project A. So even if the city would slightly favor Project A in the beginning, whenever the federal government comes in with these matching components, suddenly it's a no-brainer to go with Project B. So even though that might not be their top priority, it becomes their priority because of the availability of free money. And one thing we do know with a lot of capital projects, as we had talked about in the previous video, we oftentimes fund capital projects based upon the availability of money. So you can't have that distortion whenever the federal government uses matching components in order to incentivize certain types of actions on the part of state and local governments. But grants and aid have the most direct intergovernmental impact upon local government coffers that we see in intergovernmental fiscal relations. Then the second, again, that's the carrot approach. Then the second approach, if those grants don't work, is then the stick approach, which are mandates. Mandates are orders that the national government gives to subnational governments. And sometimes national government is referred to as the parent government that then has this parent-child relationship with state and local governments. So the national government wants to accomplish something, and it needs the state and local governments to contribute to accomplishing that goal. Use of grants doesn't work, so now you're going to use a mandate. You're going to order state and local governments to take a certain type of action. The most direct type of mandate is what's called a direct order mandate. Direct order mandates are just what they sound like. The national government will order a state or local government to take a certain action under threat of penalty of law. So the state or local government does not do what the national government tells it to do. There could be civil, and there could even, in some limited instances, criminal penalties. But you need to do what the federal government is telling you to do. Those types of direct order mandates are used by the national government, especially Congress, when it has the constitutional ability to do so. So you read through Article 1, Section 8, and if it's something that deals specifically with one of the enumerated powers of Congress, Congress can then use a direct order mandate to gain compliance on the part of state and local governments. But typically, direct order mandates only really work when the national government has the constitutional power to order compliance in this policy area from state and local governments. So there are limited categories of situations where direct order mandates can be constitutionally valid. The second type of mandate is a cross-cutting mandate. Cross-cutting mandates cut across several different policy areas. So anti-discrimination is a great example of a cross-cutting mandate. You may not discriminate in employment policy. You may not discriminate in education policy. You may not discriminate in housing policy. You may not discriminate in voting rights. Cuts across all those different policy areas. So the provisions that we see in things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, Equal Employment Opportunity Act, all of those policies are cross-cutting mandates telling state and local governments what they cannot do in terms of discriminating against people across those different policy areas. Then your third type of mandate is what's called a crossover mandate. Crossover mandates are typically used when direct order mandates cannot be used. When it's not constitutional to use a direct order mandate, national governments will typically then turn to these crossover mandates. Crossover mandates will require that state and local governments take a certain action in a policy area, and then if they refuse to do so, you then reduce their funding, and oftentimes in a related area. So, a couple of examples. Clinton administration. Clinton administration want to see a national 0.08 blood alcohol content level for drunk driving. Some states had less stringent blood alcohol levels. They had 0.10 and 0.12 and 0.16. National government, Clinton administration wanted every state to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. Now, when you read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, you see that Congress does not have the constitutional ability to impose that blood alcohol content level on all the states. It's not written in the Constitution. The president, in Article 2, doesn't have that specific power either. So lacking that constitutional power, the Clinton administration then proposed using crossover mandates, where if you don't pass a law to reduce your blood alcohol content level to 0.08, you are then going to lose highway funds, federal highway funds. So the same type of thing happened with speed limits many years ago. Federal government wanted to see a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit nationwide. Well, some states had higher speed limits, and they didn't want to abide by this new federal order. Federal government couldn't make them have a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, not constitutionally, so instead the federal government used crossover mandates. For every year that you do not reduce your speed limit to 55 miles per hour, you are going to lose, again, federal highway funds. And some states lost tens of millions of dollars. Pennsylvania, as an example, lost well over $100 million in federal highway funds, what we call ICE-T funds, because they were unwilling to lower their speed limit to 55 miles per hour. So those are examples of these crossover mandates, mandates that state and local governments tend to find especially insidious, because it's kind of, you don't do what we want to do over here, we're going to do something to you over here. Then the fourth type of mandate is what's called a preemptive mandate. In a preemptive mandate, the national government will preempt or take away the decision-making power of a state or local government in a certain policy area. Now, preemptive mandates can be either full or they can be partially preemptive. A fully preemptive mandate is one that completely takes away the legal ability of a state or local government to make a law governing this activity or governing this policy. So an example of that was the prohibition of internet access taxation. Several years ago, a handful of states, about 10 states, had what they called internet access taxes. So they would tax you as the consumer for the monthly fee that you pay your internet service provider to get access to the internet. So that $20 fee or whatever the people were paying to get access to the internet, there would then be a state tax applied to that called an internet access tax. Several years ago, Congress passed a law completely preempting the ability of a state government to have an internet access tax. So overnight, all those internet access taxes that states had vanished and they went away because Congress was able to do that because it was a fully preemptive mandate. And they were able to do that under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. What we see used a lot more of with preemption are these things called partially preemptive mandates. Partially preemptive mandates are used primarily in the area of environmental protection and regulation. So in a partially preemptive mandate, the national government will tell a state government, you have the flexibility and the ability to make your own state law as long as it is least as strict as the national standard. So you can't have a state law that is less strict than the national standard. We are preempting you from passing a law that is less strict than what the national minimum standard is. So if the state wants to pass a law in terms of air quality or water quality that is less strict than what the national government has established, you can't do that. It must be at least the national standard. You, however, do have the flexibility to go above and beyond that national minimum standard. And so we've seen California do that both in terms of air quality as well as water quality. We've seen California do that in terms of emission standards, where California laws are actually more strict than what the federal minimum standard is. So hence it's partially preempted because you're only preempted from having something less strict, but you always have the flexibility to be more strict if you would like to. But again, we usually see these partially preemptive mandates used primarily in environmental protection and regulation. Where these mandates become very troubling for us as state and local governments from a fiscal perspective is obviously when they are either partially funded or completely unfunded. And Congress does have this very nasty habit of passing mandates without attaching funding, or at least the necessary funding, to those mandates. Back in the 1990s, the National League of Cities was successful at lobbying Congress to get this thing called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act passed. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was supposed to prohibit Congress from passing unfunded or partially funded mandates to then push the financial burden off on state and local governments. That wasn't supposed to happen. That was the whole idea with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. The problem, though, is that the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was much more of a victory rhetorically than it was in reality, in that the way in which the bill was written, it is not a self-enforcing piece of legislation, meaning that in order for the provisions of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to go into effect, and what the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act said is that if Congress is considering a mandate that would impose this threshold of fiscal burden on the states, then Congress must order a study from the Congressional Budget Office to see exactly how much this is going to cost the states. And if it goes above that threshold that we're allowing, then they would have to provide funding for it. So it was supposed to provide funding for all mandates that would go above this threshold impact upon state and local governments. The problem is that provision only goes into effect if a member of Congress rises to a point of order. So whenever that legislation is being discussed in the House or the Senate, you would need to have a member rise to a point of order and say, point of order, Mr. or Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation violates the provisions of the 1995 Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. If no one rose to a point of order, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was never called into effect. The other problem with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act is that it did not, even if a member would rise to a point of order, it didn't necessarily stop a mandate. What it did do is it slowed down the implementation of those mandates. And what Congress would do is say, okay, this is going to exceed the threshold of the impact we're allowed to have. So instead of implementing it in 1 year, we will implement it over a 5-year period of time. You spread out the impact over that 5-year period of time. Each year, that impact is small enough to then fall underneath that threshold legally. So Congress has found a very easy way to work around the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, and that's why we say it's really much more of a victory rhetorically than it is in terms of reality. Most states have their own unfunded mandate reform acts. We have one here in California called Prop 1A. The problem with that Unfunded Mandates Reform Act is that its provisions can be suspended either by a declaration of fiscal emergency by the governor or the state legislature. So if the governor says we are in a fiscal emergency, he or she can automatically suspend the limitations against unfunded mandates. So unfunded mandates remain a reality, and those unfunded mandates that tend to have the biggest impact fiscally upon state and local governments. Until the federal government starts fully funding these mandates, you're always going to have that cost that state and local government's going to have to figure out how to cover. Even when state and local governments get revenue from the federal government in the form of grants and aid, there are problems with those grants and aid. There may be a lot of reporting requirements, such as with categorical grants, but also those grants and aid oftentimes are very transient. in that they are temporary in nature. Yes, you get them this year, but you are not guaranteed to get them next year or in years moving forward. So if you become overly reliant as a state or local government on intergovernmental transfers of money, intergovernmental grants, that is going to be bad for you in terms of your fiscal solvency. So you want to be very careful not to become overly reliant upon those types of grants. Also, the problem with grants, not only are they temporary and transient, but the problem with grants is that it really narrows your revenue diversity portfolio, your revenue portfolio diversity. Mike Sell, the author of your textbook, tells us that the best way for a local government to weather a downturn in the economy is to have the most diverse revenue portfolio possible. So if you're relying too much on intergovernmental grants, those grants go away. Clearly, you're not going to have any money to replace those grants with. So if you don't have money to replace the grants with, you're either going to have to increase your own taxes or you're going to have to go and cut programs. And neither of those things are very attractive options. So the way in which most local governments respond to a reduction in intergovernmental grants is they will make cuts, and the cuts they make will primarily be cuts to deferred maintenance. That's a very easy thing to cut for a local government, but it's also a very dangerous thing to cut. It's easy to cut because it's not very visible. And so voters aren't going to penalize you too much for cutting deferred maintenance. But if you cut deferred maintenance year after year after year, you know what happens. You end up creating an infrastructure crisis, and then you have a huge bill that you're going to be paying in future years. So it's good to have intergovernmental grants as part of your portfolio, but not to become too overly reliant upon them. And when it comes to revenue, the best moral of the story for local governments is to try and keep your portfolio as diversified as you possibly can. But that's just intergovernmental fiscal grants are just another piece of the puzzle in terms of our discussion of the types of revenue that are generated by state and local governments.